Now the Israeli schools have been judged by the way, what's the best school? It's not who gets the highest grade in the Bagrut. It's those graduates from a school who join the elite part of the Israeli army. That's called a good school. So it's a militarized, it's still an indoctrination process, it's still occupation, and still they consider this is a land that we return to, liberated to. It was promised for us, don't forget that.
Yes. Israel and its media platforms are still playing the same tune that the Palestinian curricula incite violence and terrorism. It's applying constant pressure concerning the terms, phrases, and topics related to the Palestinian history and everyday life. However, Israel doesn't change any of its own curricula or education textbooks related to its military offensive against the Palestinian people, and it's proud of all the crimes it committed against the Palestinians since the Nakba in 1948 until now. In order to discuss that, the Palestinian and Israeli curricula, I'm very much pleased to have the Professor of Education and Teachers Training expert in Schoolbooks, Dr. Sami Adwan. Welcome to our program, Dr. Sami.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Sam.
As I mentioned in the introduction, Doctor, that Israel claims all the time and tells the world that the Palestinian school books encourage and incite violence against Israelis and against Jews everywhere. To what extent do you think this Israeli story can be bought, if it has any grounds?
Well, the Israeli story is based on impressionist study of school books. It's based and motivated by ideology to deny the Palestinian rights and narrative to be written and narrated and included in textbooks. Through my experience in analyzing Palestinian school textbooks, I didn't find any incitement, I didn't find any stereotype or demonization or dehumanization of Israelis or Jews in general. But the Palestinians have the right to discuss, to express their daily life and their reality, and also to how the Palestinian lives under the occupation, checkpoints, destroying homes, confiscating land, uprooting the trees. These part of daily life. It's descriptions of the daily life of any Palestinian children in all Palestinian area. That's one thing. In the contrary, in the light or under the harsh living condition that Palestinians live, Palestinian longing and teaching for peace, tolerance, and also plurality in their democracy, and encouraging good example of non-peaceful approach to resolve conflict, like approach of Nelson Mandela, approach of Gandhi, and also presentation of how the disasters result of any war or any destructions. So on the contrary, Palestinians are very peaceful in their orientation. Even they encourage the peace, the Oslo Agreement in their textbooks, and also abide by UNESCO criteria for issuing and writing textbooks, to take into consideration also the UN Convention of the Rights of the Children.
Yes, and Dr. Sami, when Israel claims that the Palestinian school books use certain concepts and certain words like glorifying the people killed by the Israeli occupation forces, and Israelis describing them as shaheed, martyrs. Now, how as Palestinians we should respond to that?
Well, those Palestinians who are killed by the Israelis in daily life, it's a way of mourning. When you mourn somebody, it's a way of mourning your trauma. It's not glorifying him or her. It's a way of mourning. And also the word shaheed, in general, we don't know who's shaheed, who's not. God knows exactly. So, but we mourn ourselves kind of a way of soothing the pain of the suffered people and the relative. It's not glorifying. It's a way of showing the pain in a way that soothes the family that lost their beloved ones.
Yes, and when we talk about the religious study, the religion textbook and Islamic religion, the Israelis tell the donor community and the friends of the Palestinian people that look at the Palestinians and what they teach their children. Jihad. They are nagging over the use of the word jihad all the time, and the Quranic verses that highlight jihad. So what do you tell our friends in Europe and everywhere when it comes to this point?
First, I would like the European and the Western world to realize the importance of terminology and the words, the true meaning of jihad. Jihad has 5 meanings, and never one of them is a holy war. It's only a defensive war when you are attacked, and when your country or people attack, you have the right to defend yourself. But it's not a waging war. And that's very extremely important, the distinction between defense. And that's one thing. According to the international laws and regulation, any countries have the right to defend themselves, not only the Palestinian. And this is part of the UN Convention, Geneva 4th. So it's not launching war, it's a defense war. And do the people have the right to defend themselves? That's basically. So jihad has taken out of its exact meaning and context to stereotype or to accuse the Palestinians. It's like calling for the holy war. It's not. Yes. The Western world, if you look at the Crusaders, they called for holy war. George W. Bush, the son, the last George Bush, he called attacking Iraq as a holy war. But we never took it as a holy war. It's a defensive war. It's subject to be able to defend yourself as a human being and your country.
Yes, and in your research papers and your studies, Dr. Sami, you mentioned that the Palestinian schoolbooks teach children peace, tolerance, understanding the other, accepting the other. How can we prove that to the people who are interested in the Palestinian curricula and who have contacts with the Israelis and Israelis tell them the other story? So do you have, statistics or clear data proving the Palestinian narrative?
Of course, it's a matter of looking, in a very scientific and objective way. And if you just move through the textbooks, you find tolerance, you find democracy, you find living in peace, taking care of your neighbors, not refrain from using a violent approach in resolving conflict, using mediation, negotiation, accepting gender equality. So these texts are available in the Palestinian textbooks, and our research pointed out to these people. But it's a matter of to show it. And that's one thing. And to be honest, the Palestinian children, if you can describe the Palestinian children, how they live in their daily life, it's completely unpeaceful, completely dangerous, completely threatening. But even though the Palestinian textbooks build so much hope that peace is the way forward, and we prepare our children to live in peace if other people, Israeli, allow us to live in peace. That's the problem. So that's why even if we teach about peace, coexistence, nobody will appease the Israelis. So I will call those international who are interested. Our textbooks are available in the website. You can figure out, you can look at them. There are issues here and there to deal with, but there are, I think, very few countries in the world you can find their textbooks on the web page.
Yes.
When we try to find the Israeli textbooks, we have to go places and workshops, especially the ultra-Orthodox books. It's hardly to find them. You have to be, have some messenger to do it.
We are going to talk about that. The report issued about George Eckert Institute for International Textbook Research in Germany, and we also the findings of that report. Telling that, the Palestinian schoolbooks have certain terminology and certain concepts that confirm the Israeli claim. Now, how do you see this report, and how, as Palestinians, we can disprove that?
Well, it's not a matter of defending. It's a matter of just being able to look at George Eckert Institute and what's available in textbooks. First, George Eckert Institute they didn't do a comprehensive study. They have selected number of school books. They also analyze books that has been outdated, not anymore available. The other thing is there's contextual problems. They took text or part out of its context and try to interpret it not from the context that we live in, from their Western world. So that's very dangerous sometimes to look at it. The other thing is the language issues, like the language you have to be really very well situated in understanding the language, because the language is not only the words, it's the meaning that that lies behind it. It's the tuning sometimes more. So George Eckert Institute did not do a full analysis of Palestinian textbooks. They became under extreme pressure by power group in Europe and some newspaper like Bill Zeit and by Impact C also position to influence the result. And they, unfortunately, the last report of George Eckert report was much more fabricated than originally reflected in textbooks. And the issue of how do you see? Is it description of reality? How do you see that? Is it, if I describe the reality of the Palestinians that are not able to go to school because of there's military at the gates, military all the way back and forth from school, settlers destroying schools, how do you describe that? If you understand, we happen to be in the European Parliament in Strasbourg, and we headed by a European Parliament member who was British. And when we describe, that at that time that was CMIP, represented by Johanna Manor, and the European Parliament told him, Johanna, this is not incitement, this is description of reality. So would I, if the Israelis and the Western world think it's incitement, think it's stereotyping, I will request the Israeli to change their action. So we don't talk about uprooting tree, none, or confiscating land, or stealing water, or destroying schools, or killing children, or mating on prison.
Yes, so, and when we talk about the Israeli school books now, and how they incite and how they portray the Palestinian people, even they don't use the word Palestinian, the Arab people, to the Israeli children. You must have made research papers and studies on these school books. So if you give us a brief on mainly the school books for the primary stage in Israel.
Yeah. I'm pleased to report to you that our research that was done by Israeli professor and American professors and me, we surveyed about 402 Israeli school and about 148 Palestinian school textbooks. It's immense work. I just basically would like to report that Israeli narrative completely deny the Palestinian. As you said, they said Arab, citizen, inhabitants, dwelling people, in imperative way, not in a civilized approach. I haven't seen any pictures of images of a Palestinian in a civilized way. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. Israel is a peaceful, it's like a lamb surrounded by 70 wolves. Israeli is describing, a textbook describing the surroundings like hatching plots, like if we're chicken, we hatch plots. We are terrorists, of course, dirty, not organized, bloodthirsty. These are the images that children are inoculated as early as it could be possible. When you look at the descriptions of how even implicitly sometimes you have to understand the implicit meaning that 100 Palestinians, like they were saying, 100 Palestinians were killed. But who killed them? By themselves? Because they don't want to, that's part of Nachshon, for example. That's
yes, Dr. Sami, this leads me to another question when it comes to the Palestinian Nakba, the catastrophe caused by Israel. Do they have any narrative about the Nakba? Do they teach their children, for example, about this part of the history of this region?
No, Israeli talk about the 1948 as the year of independence, the years that where their dream came true. They hardly mention the Nakba or the catastrophe, though they mention some results, but because they were in our road to establish our country, so they deserve it. Why they are in here? They supposed not to be here. Herbert Sumir says from early ages, says, when I visited Palestine at that time, there's roads, but the roads that has many stones. We have to clear the road from the stones. So they look at us as a problem, demographically, physically. They cannot see that this land has to be shared, with the recognition of the atrocity and the massacre. Which is countless now, 32 massacres, not mentioned at all, even denied to be there. So they don't describe it. Though you find out that they are Arabs, they are not worthy to be on the land. They are on our historical promised land. So that's the image. That's why you find settlers or the youth movement ramping from place to place.
So there is full denial of the existence of the Palestinian people in the Israeli school books. Why don't the many countries that always call for reviewing the Palestinian school books and to examine them, why they don't ask for reviewing and examining the Israeli school books from your own perspective, Doctor?
From my own perspective, I think the European, especially the American, to a certain extent, they have their own issues.
Yes.
They really very inhibited when you to come even to criticize Israeli, in relation to their atrocity against the Palestinian. Not to mention that they dare to ask the Israeli to open their textbooks. And when the EU issue came, that they want to analyze the textbooks, and they just came with a very naive answer. We don't support Israeli schools, but we support Palestinian schools. Then I told them, no, you support Israeli schools and Israeli education. And I told them, because you have good economic relation with Israel, and that make the Israeli economy prosper, grow, and that goes part of it to education. So you cannot distinguish it. I think the European especially, they feel the guilt still of the Holocaust issues. They are shunned by any attempt or dare to attempt to try to say Israeli did wrong. And that's why it's a European issue, it's not our issue. They have to do their homework.
Yes, and Dr. Sami, my final question to you concerning the Palestinian education sector and the challenges that it is facing now in Jerusalem, as Israel has a systemic campaign against the Palestinian education sector there. So, from your own perspective, how the Israeli campaign affects the Palestinian education sector there, and also the right of the Palestinian children to know about their country, about their history, about their culture and heritage?
Israeli acts as an occupying power in East Jerusalem or in the all occupied Palestinian territory of 1967. This is part of Judaizing the area. That's one thing. By the way, the attempt to change the Palestinian school education and textbooks in Jerusalem did not start now. Started in late 70s. And there's the Palestinian revolt against that. That's against, by the way, Geneva Fourth Convention, that the occupier should not interfere with the social activity of the occupied, nor to transfer their people. So what they did now, they put so much pressure on the Palestinian East Jerusalem. They take the Palestinian textbooks, censor them, take anything related to the Palestinian narrative, culture, tradition, way of life, and they put instead of it content related to Israeli and peace. So many research has been done of that. Now they use what they call the carrot and stick. If you don't come, we will put pressure on you, we cut your service, we don't give you enough support, etc., etc. Now they push for the Palestinian in East Jerusalem to use the back roads, which is the Israeli curriculum, was completely in contrary with the Palestinian identity, where we try to establish our identity, our history. And now when you look at what they propose, it's only Israeli histories. So it's a matter of erasing children's memory and identity and history and background and country. Even the name of the country will be changed. Street has been changed. So it's a very dangerous move that the Israeli do. But the international community, they don't do that. They don't object that. Why are you interfering? The people, according to UNESCO, any country, any population has the right to teach their own history, their culture, their traditions, their daily life, but they don't want us to do that. So part of Israelization or Judaizing of East Jerusalem, that's part of the plan. Look at how the city has been evacuated from its own inhabitant. Look at the budget that is allocated to the Palestinian school in East Jerusalem. It's minimal. East Jerusalem lack about 5,000 classrooms in the crowded, using old building, etc. So, and now the Israeli municipality of Jerusalem sent an order to all schools: if you don't abide in joining the back route from 2024-25, you have to find another place for you to study in. So this is as much as you can do. It's a threatening under the the thumb of the stick. It's not. It's a very serious issue what they do, and I think it's part of. This is a country for us. This is nobody should have the right to be there. Yeah. So basically they use. Just to add, very clear point. Even if from early age, from kindergarten. Those kindergarten children who age 3, 4, 5 years, they take them to military bases. They ask them to play with guns and with tanks.
As part of the educational
system.
Part Yes. Dr. Sami Adwan, Professor of Education, Teacher Training, and expert in Schoolbooks. It was a great pleasure having you on our program. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching. I'm from you, Sami Adwan. Have a nice time.